How to answer a perfect A-level geography question. We're going to look at Superpowers question today. Assess the extent to which emerging countries need both hard and soft power to extend their global influence. This is a 12-mark question that could come up in your exam. Here are the key components of the question. Number 1, assess. Very important. Trigger word that you need to understand. It's referring to the premise of the question, so you've got to argue or give evidence that answers the question, but also come up with arguments which perhaps counter the premise of the question. So in this case, you've got to refer to emerging countries, not countries such as the United States or the United Kingdom, but countries such as perhaps China and India. And you've got to talk about hard power and soft power and how they may try to increase or extend their global influence. If we look at the assessment objectives, from the basic level, entry level, you've got to have accurate and relevant geographical knowledge in your answer throughout. But to get up to 9 to 12 marks, you've got to focus on the knowledge and understanding, making logical or relevant connections. You've got to come up with a full and coherent interpretation with evidence, and you've also come to a judgment at the end of the significance of the particular issues and whether the hard and soft power that the emerging countries are using actually helps to extend their global influence, or whether there is argument that it does not. When you're coming to revise, a good way to break down an exam question is by making some notes before you start answering the question completely. So here's a template that you can use. On the left hand side, you can mention an emerging nation. So in this case, I've put down China and Russia, and you can choose whichever one you want. Then I'd write down some examples of hard power. So is it direct hard power? Is it political? Is it economic? Is it neo-colonial? Is it military? Most candidates tend to focus on the military or perhaps the political. And also do the same for your other nation if you want to add more detail to your notes. Then be specific and write down how it does and it does not extend that country's influence. Then do the same for soft power. So in this context, soft power will refer to cultural influences such as arts, media, music, food, and so forth. And again, is that direct or is that indirect influence that they are trying to extend? What's the evidence for and what's the evidence against? Remember, this question is asking to assess the extent. So it doesn't want you to agree with the premise of the question. It wants some arguments that does corroborate with it, but also you need to demonstrate your authority in your answer by countering those arguments too. Remember, you must explain in logical steps, and the only way you're going to be able to achieve to do that is if you've broken down the question before you start answering the question. Remember, if you're in the exam, you want to highlight, underline the keywords, make some annotations before you start answering the question. Maybe even write down a few bullet points of what each paragraph is going to focus on. It will help you to clear your mind, help you to get your ideas in a logical order, and help you to write a much better and clearer answer. But of course, if you're not practicing this as you're going along, you're not going to do this in the exam. So make sure that you are heeding this advice. Make sure that you apply your knowledge and understanding, and you must address the question clearly through a well-developed written answer. Do you need to write an introduction for an assess style question? In short, no. But if you really want to, you can do. Let's have a look at some examples. Number 1. In order to expand their global influence, emerging nations must use both hard and soft power tactics. However, it could be argued that in the present day, soft power exertion is more valuable. So this is an introduction that a candidate has written. Let's break it down. What they've said here is entirely valid. However, this candidate has just generalized things and hasn't given some examples of things that they will talk about in their answer. A better introduction here would be to specifically refer to examples of hard and soft power tactics that they are referring to, and also contextualize it with a specific case study or relevant example that they're going to focus on. That would be far better than just rehashing the words from the question as an introduction. This is a common thing that most students will end up doing, and it's very important that you think about or break down the question, and in the introduction you focus on what you want the examiner to give you the marks for. Here's another sample answer. Countries need both hard and soft power to exert their influence and increase it. A valid point. Would be better if a specific example was established. This is especially true for emerging countries as they are yet to show much of their influence. So far this candidate has already written 3 lines and they haven't actually got very far in establishing or giving evidence that they have authority over this question. So generic points being made, but so far nothing solid has come through. Countries part of the BRICS and mints, such as Brazil, Russia, India and China, as well as those countries who are rich in oil, are using both hard or soft power. Now, BRICS and mints are just an acronym for specific groupings of countries. It's not actually a trade bloc, and it's not actually an economic or political organization. It's more kind of a consulting forum which is formulated after the premise of an idea that an academic came up with. The candidate is talking about hard and soft power, is trying to give some evidence for how that might be extended, but it's not really giving any information at all in here. Hard power is using military or economic power to influence countries, while soft power uses more cultural and political influences. This is a much, much better line. Now, if that come right at the beginning of the paragraph, and then that was broken down, or perhaps a separate paragraph coming off it, giving an example of hard power, with reference to a specific example and how a country uses, or developing or emerging country is using that to extend their influence, that would be fantastic. So again, this is an example of how a candidate is writing their thoughts onto a page, eventually gets to a good point, but may find that their time might run out in the exam. This is why it's so important. Plan out your answer, think about things before you put pen to paper in terms of fully writing your answer, and that will help you to get to the point very quickly and get the knowledge that you have across to the examiner. Here's another sample answer. Joseph Nye was the literal founder of the term soft power, defining it as the use of cultural and economic and other non-competitive methods to increase a country's power in the world. Okay, some reference to a specific terminology has been given. However, even before the term soft power was truly established, countries have used economic and cultural factors such as aid or film and religion in order to increase their global influence. Now, soft power will include things such as aid and film. So these lines that this candidate has written is not demonstrating their authority over the subject. It's a little bit confusing. And if this was an introductory paragraph, it wouldn't set the scene very well for the rest of the answer that would be coming along. So again, think carefully about, in this question in particular, establish some examples of hard power, establish some examples of soft power in the context of an emerging country that you will discuss, And that's it. Then move on to your first point, which may be about hard power, your second point, which will be about soft power, and then maybe some counter-argument paragraph afterwards. That will really help you to establish a really good introduction. Let's have a look at some examples of structuring a key point or a key point paragraph. Hard power is a lot more dated way to extend global influence, especially military influence, and as it causes high tensions between countries and would make more enemies compared to allies, which wouldn't help an emerging country. Okay, the candidate here is putting a lot of things in and trying to cram as much as possible in, and it gets a little bit confusing. Some of the points that have been made here are completely valid, so hard power, military influence. Even better would be to contextualize it straight away into a specific example, which this candidate goes on to talk about. However, China still uses this method as a way to show their dominance over the region and nearby with one of their larger militaries in the world. You could actually argue that they have the largest military in the world and give some specific numbers, i.e. they have 2 million active soldiers ready to be engaged in a war. They have 1,000 military jets, for example. Some specific examples would be really good. This can be seen in the South China Sea, where they are creating man-made islands. So I think you're referring to the Spratly Islands in this answer, and military bases far off their coastline. So that might be in places like Djibouti. Again, demonstrate your authority by referring to specific places, and in that way it reduces the vagary that may exist around what you're trying to say. They want to be part of a trade route. Absolutely a valid point. Even better would be to say that they are establishing the Belt and Road Initiative, and as part of that, establishing the military bases and the naval bases will help to protect that trade, or the sea element of the Belt and Road Initiative. They want to be part of the trade route and show their influence in the area, as trade is a key part for emerging countries to keep growing, to grow and keep growing. You can see how China has used hard power to extend their global influence. So lots of really positive things in this paragraph, which, if they were sharpened, would be an outstanding paragraph, which refers to how a country such as China is able to extend its global influence through hard power. Next sample answer. Russia invading Crimea in 2014 was an exertion of hard power. Very good start. Establishes a specific emerging country, refers to a specific place, and gives an example of exertion of hard power. In the form of military action, 20 to 30,000 troops were deployed to seize oil and gas reserves from the Ukraine. This information is less accurate and a little bit vague. Russia were successful in gaining propaganda for domestic consumption, so they accessed mining, energy, port infrastructure. So this is partly accurate. They did access port infrastructure because they have a deep water port there that they wanted to regain access to. That was primary reason for why they invaded the Crimea. The economic cost of this invasion was $82 billion. I'm not sure what the importance of that piece of information is. Despite these advantages, the risks were greater. A little bit vague. Its global influence took a political hit as the UK condemned their actions, as well as Japan, who stopped talks regarding trade investment and visa payments. That is a much better line in comparison to the previous two. All 67 countries condemned Russia, which acquired Russia's new image as a dangerous and unpredictable state. I'm not sure which 67 countries are being referred to here, but it might be better to talk about blocks, such as NATO. And absolutely, it's a valid point to make, the fact that Russia's image has been classified as being dangerous and unpredictable. But in what part of the world? That's something to consider too. Only Germany were quiet in media coverage due to them and Russia having close economic ties, probably because of Nord Stream 2 that they were trying to build at the time, or they were building at the time. So, some very good points in this paragraph. Again, however, some misinformation in the middle parts of this paragraph, and then it gets back some validity and authority in the latter part of this paragraph. Just be careful with your knowledge, because if it is a little bit bitty and you're kind of making things up as you're going along in your answer, likelihood is that your examiner is going to know these specific case studies and these specific examples, and it doesn't demonstrate your knowledge and understanding about the issue at hand. The other thing to add to this would be the questions asking you to assess the extent to which the country is able to extend their hard and soft power. For this paragraph, right at the end, there isn't really a final judgment. So it's really important that right at the end, maybe even one line, just say, to a large extent, this demonstrates Russia's inability to demonstrate global influence because of the condemnation that they may receive from X, Y, or Z country. You could easily argue it from the other perspective too. Although hard power is effective at bringing about drastic, immediate results, it can sever international alliances and harm a nation's relationships. A very broad introduction to this paragraph, but it commands authority immediately by the types of words that are being used, evaluation as it's going along. Presently, emerging powers are adopting soft power tactics in order to gain greater global influence. A perfectly valid point to make, which is then further developed. Though these tactics take longer to establish, it is done through less harmful method of cultural diffusion and gradual spread of a nation's economic and demographic ideology. The candidate is clearly talking about a specific example, developing it and enhancing it in this context. Then goes on to talking about a specific example. This includes the neo-colonial influence that China has over Africa. A valid point to make, although I would say a little bit vague. By investing heavily into infrastructure within less developed African nations, such as the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, China is exerting its cultural influence. A perfectly valid point to make would be certainly improved if a specific example was given, and I think in this case, it's probably not cultural influence, but more economic influence that's happening here. This gives it a strong predominance over the large majority of the continent. I don't think with regards to DRC, one country, that China has a larger influence on the rest of the continent of Africa, but it's understandable what the candidate is trying to say. I think that is a little bit vague, a point, but I can understand what they're trying to communicate. Additionally, more emerging BRIC countries are turning to Chinese banking services. This is a very valid point, and less are using traditional Western banks, such as, that would be really good to put here, the World Bank and the IMF, for example. Now, I think there is an opportunity that's been slightly lost here. Talking about the influence of Chinese banking services in a bit more depth would add more quality to this answer, but the point has been established. This gradually strips the Western powers of their power, giving it to China. Absolutely valid point to make, and this candidate goes on to evaluate why this is the case. And that's what helps them to achieve or got up to the level 3 sort of answer. This is a really good example of how your answer can be scaffolded out, but this is only possible if you have an in-depth understanding of the concepts of superpowered geographies and a good understanding of the different players that are involved. And that will allow you to write succinctly and well in your exam. You discuss in this answer. For assessment objective 1, you could talk about the characteristics of emerging superpowers. You could talk about the range of mechanisms from hard to soft power and their effectiveness. You could talk about the indirect and direct mechanisms of power, political, economic, neo-colonial, military. And you could talk about soft power, cultural influences such as arts, media, and food. Basic level answers, 6 marks or below, probably going to talk about those things to some reasonable degree. To get the higher order marks, you need to go into it in a little bit more depth. So the things that you could include, as you've seen from the previous examples, are things like traditional hard power. China has the largest standing army in the world. It also has regional projection via Blue Water Navy and land reclamation through the Spratly Islands. That's something that you could refer to in quite a bit of depth. Or you could talk about joint projects with Western TNCs. For example, Foxconn and Apple working together, a Taiwanese TNC with a US-based TNC employing Chinese labour. That's an example that could be very good to use in your answer. There are lots of different ways that you could approach this answer. These are just some basic points that you could refer to, but by no means the only points that you can refer to. How can you improve your writing? Practice writing. Always go and do more exam questions. The more you practice writing, the better you're going to get at writing and communicating your ideas on a piece of paper. Read newspaper articles. It's very easy to find them. Go online, type in neocolonialism in the world today. Maybe pick out some newspapers that you want to specify, and I guarantee you're probably going to find some opinion articles or other more detailed articles, and they will help you to think about how you could structure each paragraph to come up with a naturally flowing, coherent argument. And then all you have to do is just try to replicate that in your own writing. Use words such as because, despite, some, but. Always write in the third person. For example, the most critical factor appears to be. Write as if the person reading your answer gets the sense you're speaking with authority. From the final sample answer we looked at, that's a good example of how someone can communicate their authority over the subject matter. And obviously, we're still writing with pen in the exam hall, so learn to write clearly and neatly, and then that way your ideas are easily read by the examiner. Finally, make sure you've written down this question. Assess the extent to which emerging countries need both hard and soft power to extend their global influence on a piece of paper, and go and do this question. You've got about 7 days. Go do the question, use your textbook, use your notes, whatever you want to use from online, wherever it might be. Think about what kind of things you want to talk about in each of your paragraphs. Think about how you're going to refer back to the original question at the end of each of those paragraphs. Perhaps even consider writing a separate paragraph evaluating or stating your position. Again, make sure that you spend time writing out your answers, even if it's a paragraph or two, because the more you do over a consistent period of time, the better you'll get. And when it comes to the actual exam, you're going to be much more ready and confident about what you're going to write, and write clearly and do your best when you get there. Another exam question coming up next week. I'll see you then.